Whenever you're ready.
All right, we will open the Public Planning Commission meeting for September 15th at 6:30. We'll rise for Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, go ahead and do our roll call of commissioners.
Mr. Wood.
Here.
Commissioner Melcher.
I'm here.
Commissioner Wolfius.
Here.
Commissioner Parker.
Here.
Commissioner Stevens.
Here.
Commissioner Journey.
Present.
And Commissioner Lohman.
Here.
Okay, all are present. There's a quorum.
Right. So at this portion of our meeting, if anybody is here wishing to address the commission on any business that is not on our agenda for the evening, now would be the time to do so. All right. As there is none, we will move on to our public hearing, looking at the housing needs analysis and buildable lands inventory. Angela, would you like me to open this individually or?
Just open it up as one.
Okay.
It's one presentation, so just open it up as one single.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and open up the public hearing for the housing needs analysis and buildable lands inventory at 6:32. All right, and at this time, I will go ahead and hand it over to our visitors, 3J Consulting and
FCS Group, yeah.
Thank you. All right,
Excellent.
floor is yours.
Chair and Commissioners, thank you for having us here tonight. Hopefully we'll have something interesting to share with you and get some good feedback. I'm Scott Freganesi with 3J.
I'm Tim Wood with FCS Group.
And we'll do the presentation tonight and we'll have a chance for some comments, questions, ideas. And then I think after we're going to even be able to open up for to the public to do the same. So we'll just jump right in. Hopefully you remember last time we did some presentations. There's going to be some repeat material that we showed in terms of the mapping. There'll be some new material as well. So we do the welcome, which we just did. We'll do a little bit of project overview. We'll review the buildable lands inventory, which you had seen previously, but a couple new maps now, which are kind of neat. And then Tim's going to go through the reconciliation of the residential land supply and demand, and then we'll just talk about our next steps. So we have another meeting we'll go through, and then we're pretty close to the finish line on this one. So this slide, I just want to let you know that there's the elements of housing needs analysis. If you look at the bullet points, that's really what it is. The first thing, if you remember our first meeting, we showed what your housing needs projection was. We looked at your forecast population growth, and we determined what your needs would be in terms of how many new housing units you would need and what type of housing it should be. The second kind of element of the housing needs analysis is what we call the buildable lands inventory, where we're identifying what capacity you have in terms of land for development. And then the residential land needs analysis, we'll show you that tonight. And then our third meeting that we'll have, we're really going to start reviewing and coming up with some recommendations and for things that you could do to encourage the types of housing that you want and that you need for your growth over the next 20 years. And as we have a discussion tonight, that's kind of the part I hope we can kind of focus on is, you know, what kinds of things can we change or do to encourage the types of housing that are needed. And then I think the next slide is the schedule. So our first meeting was in May. We're now in September, and we're having our second committee meeting. The Planning Commission is obviously serving as our committee as part of this process. And we're having our public open house, which will happen after we close this formal meeting. And then I'm hoping maybe early October or late October, early November, we can come back and do our third meeting. Depending on schedule, it may shift. We haven't really figured out the schedule yet, but tentatively we'd like to get that one done. And that's where we'll come back with kind of the final H&A and recommendations that we'd like to discuss with you. And then I think Tim is up.
That's right. So commissioners, thank you for joining us tonight. Really briefly want to review what happened in our last meeting about the housing needs projection, just for the sake of making sure that everything kind of flows together. So to review briefly, the thing that really drives the housing needs projection is the population growth projection from Portland State University. So here you see a graph of how that looks for Sweet Home over the next 20 or so years. The bottom line is you're adding 1,573 new people over the next 20 years. So pretty substantial amount of folks to plan for. That does it for that slide. The next slide goes into what your existing housing inventory looks like. This will also drive the housing needs projection. Based on, this, we tend to sort of project out how the future housing needs are going to look. So for that 1,700 new people we're planning for, mostly they're going to be living in single family detached. So as you can see here today, 73% single family detached. So pretty standard statewide, a nice mix of middle housing, in 7% in townhomes plexes, 7% in multifamily, and then in the mobile home category, about 13% of housing units. So that's your 4,107 units that are in Sweet Home today, and then vacancy rates in 2020 about 5%. So pretty standard.
And wouldn't you say that's a pretty good, healthy
Oh, yeah.
housing mix?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very standard. It's a great housing mix.
A lot of
for sure.
cities you see a lot less of the multifamily and townhomes and things like that.
Right.
Can we ask questions as you go along?
Of course, yeah, please.
Yeah, so I guess maybe you just touched on that. I just wondered how this mix compares with other cities of a similar size in Oregon.
It's almost dead on. I mean, it's right there in the center of the bell curve, especially for cities around 10,000. Usually about 3/4, 2/3 to 3/4 of the housing stock is single family detached, and then there's kind of a mix. But this is a great mix of the other types. 7%, 13%. That's good. That's it's right in there. Same as most cities we work in. The next slide goes into tenure by structure. So that's a measure of who lives where. So the green element of these bars shows owner-occupied units. So as you would expect, most of your single-family detached units are owner-occupied. So the folks who live in those own them. And then the kind of the gray slate components of these bars, that's renter-occupied. So you can see in townhomes, plexes, and multifamily, those are predominantly renter-occupied. And then in your mobile home, manufactured home category, it's a 50-50 split or so. So again, great mix, very standard for towns this size. The next slide goes into average household size, which is another really important component of the calculation. It's basically what we divide the population growth by to determine how many housing units we need. So what we really want to focus on there is on the far right for the city of Sweet Home. We give you 3 years there to take a look at. And you can see in 2020, we're at 2.59 people per dwelling unit, which again, right kind of in the center of the bell curve there. You can see that it's sort of fluctuated between 2.41 in 2010 up to 2.72 in 2015, and then back down to 2.59 in 2020. I would say that that's probably mostly to do with just kind of noise in the data. So it's just probably right there. I mean, 2.59 is probably the correct number.
So that's my question. Like, how important is the discrepancy between these three columns?
Well, I would say that it's pretty important because it is one of the major driving figures that determines what the housing needs projection is. Because, to make it really simple, we take that population growth figure, that 1,700, and we divide it by 2.59 to determine new units. There's other components of that calculation in there, but that's the kind of the quick and dirty version of it. So
let's say you had like a larger household size. You had a 3.5, which is larger families. They have more people in a housing unit. The projection would be less. You need less housing units because you have larger households.
Right.
So I didn't ask my question correctly.
Okay.
My question really was, how significant is the difference between 2.41 versus 2.59?
It's not super significant.
Okay,
you
that's
know-
what you're saying about the noise.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and this does show you that you're, I mean, 2.59 is a great landing place. It makes me feel pretty confident about the data to see that. The next slide gets into severe rent burden, which is something that the state's required us to include in this, and I think it's a good thing for cities to consider. This is a measure of number or share of renter households that spend 50% or more of their income on housing. And that's just rent alone. And you can see in Sweet Home, 28% of your renter households are spending 50% or more of their income on rent. So pretty significant, but you can see, compare it with Lynn County and the state, it's close. It's a little higher than either one. So certainly something to consider as we discuss policy going forward.
It's still a high number, 28%.
28%. I mean, that's close to 30%, close to, a little between a quarter and a third of your renter households are spending a lot of money on rent. So,
And most cities in Oregon are dealing with, high cost of housing right now and nationwide. So it's not something that is unique to you.
absolutely true.
Question for you on this then. This is only rents.
Right.
Is there a similar measure on, I guess, mortgage burdened households?
There is, yeah. It's not as significant, so we didn't include it here. It's usually, I'm trying to recall off the top of my head what it is in the model for Sweet Home, but it's usually in that 10 to 15% range, so it's still high,
Right.
and it's still certainly worth considering.
Well, and there's a check on that usually with the mortgage companies. They're going to put a limit on exactly who they'll loan
Sure.
to and all that. With renters, you got to have a place to live.
Right.
We're also observing that our housing is lower from our income is lower.
Right.
And that affects that rent burden for sure.
Right.
So if you had more affordable housing, you would have less people, percentage of people that were rent burdened.
Right. It's kind of both
Yeah.
components of that
Exactly.
calculation, right?
Yep.
And the next slide kind of gets into how that affordability component has been changing. This certainly doesn't speak to rent specifically, but it does give you a sense of how the market is changing in Sweet Home and statewide. And you can see here, you're up over $100,000 per unit. This is the average, it's the median home value in Sweet Home. So the median's shifted from $244,000 in March of 2020 to $348,000 in March of 2022. So close to 20% annual growth over the last 2 years. So yeah, I mean, even early returns over the last couple of months have shown a slight downtick, but you're still looking at maybe a 0.1% decrease.
There you go.
Yeah, so we'll take it. We'll take it though. We will take it. And you can see, that's true region-wide. Any city in the region dealing with the exact same situation. Although your annual change is the highest among these cities, it's still, you can see that it's not a unique circumstance.
Well, it's also because you started at the lowest.
Right. Right. Yeah. So starting.
Yeah.
Yeah. The next slide also sort of speaks to that affordability question. This time we're looking at it from an income perspective. These wages that you see here on the right side of this infographic are average wages for the state. So a lawyer in Oregon on average earns $128,000. That's regardless of geographic location. But it's as good as we can get on data. And you can see here, in these calculations, the lawyer's probably going to have no problem affording a home in Sweet Home. Their max mortgage, at that wage, would be $655,000. So they're going to have, they're not going to have too hard of a time. Although I'm sure that inventory is an issue. Similar situation with the engineer. They're going to be able to afford a home in that, median home value range. As we get closer to the middle here with middle school teachers, for instance, who are earning $67,000 a year on average, their max mortgage at that wage is $340,000. So right at the cusp of the median home value. As we get down to the medical assistant and retail salesperson, we're probably looking more at their rent at that point. And you can see that the max rent, if we're using the 30% of wages being used for home or rent purposes, $1,000 for the medical assistant and $800 for the retail salesperson. I'm sure that that would be quite a struggle to find an affordable.
There's nothing available at that price.
Right, and if they do, the quality is questionable, right? So, right. So, it's a tough situation for folks who aren't earning, you know, that six-figure or high five-figure income.
And that also means that the people that we need in our community to serve those jobs can't live here also.
Precisely.
It means they have to travel, which makes them harder to keep in the area as
Yeah.
well.
The next slide breaks down our projected housing need by type. So using the population growth figure, the average household size figure, and a couple of other adjustment figures, we determine you're going to need about 632,000 homes over the next 20 years. So pretty substantial addition.
632.
Yes, I'm sorry. What did I say?
You said 1,000.
632,000. That's not gonna work, man.
Yeah, that urban growth boundary might need to
Run
expand.
out of-
Sorry.
run out of land.
Yeah. Sorry.
You have some great business coming to me.
So 632 new dwelling units over the next 20 years, to be very explicit. So using, again, that breakdown of homes by type in Sweet Home right now, you see 460 of those homes would be single-family detached, we would expect. So the vast majority in that category. You've got a nice mix there of townhomes, plexes, and multifamily, 42 for townhomes and plexes, 45 for multifamily, and then 85 new mobile home units. In addition, we're looking at about 15 people in group quarters population. So that's folks who live in dormitory type situations, congregate care facilities, jails, that kind of thing. So, oh, yes, sir.
Looking at the 632 over 20 years, that's about 30 a year.
Yeah.
How many building permits do we issue in a year?
For single-family homes, around 30 is actually not too far off. I mean, that's a high number right now. But this year we're past that. We're about 32 so far, and that's not even, we haven't even reached the end of the year. This is a unique year when it comes to that. The average would be lower, more around the lines of 25 or so.
Everyone's, we're kind of right on.
Right.
Yeah, we've had some years in the not too distant past that were just barely into the double digits.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. The last 4 years or so have been a lot more building activity than previous to that.
yeah.
So we hope that over a 20-year time frame, this is kind of right on. You know, over that period of time, we feel like pretty confident about 632.
But the multifamily units and the townhomes seems miserably low. I mean, if we look at the apartment buildings that have been built in the last year or two, I don't know how many units they have, but it seems like we probably exceeded that number right there.
I think there's also a if you build it, they will come kind of situation with the apartments. I think we've been so low for so long.
Right.
We have a lot of catching up to do. It's hard to say, but yeah, in this is all based on 2020 numbers, right? So soon after this, we had a brand new apartment complex of 48 units open, and it filled pretty much in the
Right.
first 2 months. After it opening, and then we've got another 40 units behind City Hall here that are
Right on
I don't think they're
Street.
open yet, but they're ready to.
Yeah.
So, but again, I mean, those are going to be filled. The ones that opened on Long Street, my understanding is they basically were filled by people who already were in the area,
Right.
and it's just a matter of moving up to better quality housing than where they already were.
Right. And also because the rent prior to that, our rental inventory has been really slim.
Which is probably a reason for that rent burden as well. So anyway, to that end, though, as we discuss policies going forward, maybe part of that is seeing ways that we can encourage the development of, multifamilies or townhomes or plexes or other kind of rental stock. So that does it for this component of the presentation. Are there any questions to this point? Okay.
All right.
I'll hand it over.
All right. I get to do the maps, which is my favorite part anyway. You've seen a lot of these, so I don't want to spend too much time on them, but the settlement pattern, these are your building footprints. So you can see, if you squint a little bit, you can see where you're developed. I believe the next one shows tax lots. So these are all the parcels throughout the city. The next one is your existing land use. So we identify what land use, regardless of zoning or comprehensive plan, this is what your existing land use. These categories are a little different. You'll see things like vacant, forest, agriculture, public, semi-public, as well as commercial, industrial, multifamily, and manufactured homes. The next one shows us your zoning map. So this is your zones. You, as planning commissioners, you're probably very familiar with this map. It's one you probably use a lot. So we don't need to spend too much time on that one. And I believe the next one is your comprehensive plan map. One thing that I was actually pretty impressed with is your zoning map and your comprehensive map are actually very closely related. Many cities I work in, that's not the case. They don't match. They should match, at least somewhat. So that's kudos to you for keeping your plans updated so they correspond with each other. This shows residential lands. Now, most cities don't show this because you can see there's a few sections where it's not residential land, but because you allow residential in your commercial zones, really the only areas I think don't allow residential is industrial zoning. All other zoning categories allow some sort of residential land, so that's not a bad thing. And this is what we identified as vacant. So I think if you remember back to our first meeting, we showed this map and we got some good feedback from the group saying, no, that's not vacant, that is vacant. So we've refined this map now and we're more confident getting feedback from you all and staff on identifying vacant land. And it's partially vacant. So partially vacant basically assumes that parcels that are larger than 1/2 acre, but have one dwelling unit on it, could potentially be divided and another unit could be placed on it. So the idea is you want to identify those areas that could be, you could call it infill, I suppose. But yeah, those are areas that have a home on them but have more land that could be utilized for housing. Partially vacant miscellaneous. So this is at least 1/2 acre of underdeveloped land. So that's what that means. And the next one shows all vacant land. So this is a combination of the last 3 slides that I showed, 3 maps. So you can see you do have quite a bit of vacant land, which is great. You'll see that moving forward with and the next slide I believe shows the acreages. Nope, it doesn't. This is developed land, which has redevelopment potential. So the other thing we identify is lands that we could see potential redevelopment. And usually that's done, so improvement of value above 10,000 and at least 20,000 square feet is deemed to have some amount of redevelopment potential. So usually what we do here is we look at land to improvement value ratios. And so if the improved structure is on land that's worth more than the structure, or the structure is not worth much, likely that's going to redevelop. It's an assumption. The next one. So this is now a combination of all your vacant lands and what we would look at for redevelopment potential. Any questions on that one? Okay. So now that we've identified all of your vacant lands by type, obviously there's some constraints. There's things that will not allow for development, things like water and slopes and things like that. So we'll go through those, and those are removed from your buildable lands inventory. So public and semi-public land. So these are things that parks, public facilities, things that wouldn't be in the realm of for private development. So those are removed as well. Oh, well, Parks is too. I said that for the last slide, but Parks is removed. Open water, clearly you're not going to be, well, I guess you could have a houseboat, but we're not counting those. So we removed open water as a constraint. Floodplains, we also restricted by 100%. Now, this was something that we went back and forth on. Some cities don't restrict it 100%. You can technically build in a floodplain if you construct to FEMA standards. But because you have enough vacant land, it was easier for us to exclude it. And you don't have a lot of floodplains either. So it didn't really change the calculations much if we just made the assumption that we were going to restrict it by 100%, even though you could potentially see some housing development in those areas. Steep slopes. So any slope above 25% was also removed from your buildable lands inventory. You have some of those. The wetland areas also. Locally significant wetlands are constrained. This is another one where we removed it, but you can mitigate wetlands and develop wetlands. But the idea was that, most of the time it's expensive and difficult to do wetland mitigation, and you have other lands that are available that would be used for development before you would start running into trying to tackle development in wetland areas.
I'd have to look at it again. It's not too far off. And frankly, our local inventory hasn't been updated in a very long time. So the accuracy of it is questionable.
And I believe this is a state level data. So
right.
Wetland data is always tough because there's a local data that the cities have, then there's state data, and then the feds have another data set.
Yeah, one area actually that we run into all the time is the old airport. On here, it shows no wetlands. Everybody who's come to us to look at buying that property and has had a number of problems trying to make it pencil out. And so we keep on seeing a different face. Probably every year, somebody comes in trying to see if they can do it, and then they give up, and somebody else tries next year. It's frustrating.
What's the next slide, I think? Okay, so those are the constraints. We got through, those are all the constraints that were removed. So now we get to the exciting part. What is your supply? How much buildable land do you have? Actually, let me see if I can borrow this from you real quick. And then, here we go. So we divided it by acres by type. So if you remember, we talked about partially vacant and partially vacant miscellaneous and redevelopment potential. So you have about 29 acres of redevelopment potential. That's that kind of pink fuchsia color. You have about 153 acres of partially vacant miscellaneous. That's that tan color. You have 322 acres of partially vacant single family. And then you have about almost 600 acres of vacant land for buildable acres. So that's substantial. You have a lot of buildable acres. And the next slide, we actually take it a little further and look at it by zone, by zoning category. And this is important because the zoning will tell you what the capacity is, because different zones obviously clearly have different density allowances. They allow different types of housing in different zones. So we need to know how many acres by zone. And if you go through this, there's about, it's really hard to read the smaller ones, but we'll start with, there's about 74 in highway commercial. There's about 27 in neighborhood commercial. And that might be actually residential industrial transition is what that is. You have about 53 in high density residential, 36 acres in medium density residential, and about 526 in your low density residential. So the majority of your vacant land is in low density residential, but you do have a significant number of, the one that stood out to me was actually the highway commercial. And I see, even going through town, I see a lot of those areas being developed. I think there's some townhomes that are in that zone that I saw tonight when I drove by. So that, to me, that was interesting that you have substantial number of acres in your highway commercial that could be potential for housing. And that is it for the buildable lands inventory. Did anyone have any questions on the maps or thoughts?
I'm very visual, so I appreciate how effort you've gone into put these all in maps and overlaid all of them together. It does make it just such a read.
Yeah, I really I call them map builds. So you build upon layers, and I have to. Yulia Reisman is my GIS manager, and she's just great. So I have to give her props for building all these maps. I didn't create them myself.
Can I interrupt just really quick?
Yeah.
Commissioners, can you make sure that your mics are faced right at you and turned up? Because when you speak, I haven't been able to hear you. So please make sure they're directional mics. So make sure that you're talking into them. Sorry for the interruption. I just can't hear when people are talking.
That's good.
So I have a question and was wondering if you have any data or information about wildfire resiliency as we look at building. Sweet Home is kind of in a pocket where we have to think about that. And I'd like to consider that as we think about developing different areas first and prioritizing the most important.
That is a really good point. And the state just did come out with recently with fire danger areas, and I think it was Dogami is who comes out with that data. And it would be really cool to overlay that over some of these zones. You could actually use it as a constraint, just as an exercise to learn about that, lay it over the top and remove those acres to see how much you have left. If you could somehow figure out a way to, not build in those areas that are, most susceptible to wildfire, and still have enough land needs, that would be an interesting policy discussion to have.
All right, back to me, and back to a table that we've seen before. So just to review really quickly, 632 new units, not 632,000. And just to kind of review again where we expect those to land, just because the next component of this analysis is fusing this projection of new housing units with the buildable land inventory and making sure that land, that buildable land, will be able to accommodate this number of new units. So again, vast majority in single family detached, 460 of those units there. And then you've kind of got a mix of other middle housing types after that. The next slide gets a little more into what the residential land needs analysis is all about. So you'll notice there on the far left of this table, those same numbers from the prior table, those projected new housing units. The next two columns show the applicable comprehensive plan designation and the applicable local zoning codes that we expect those new dwelling units to land in based on the density of development that's allowed on those zones. The next column over shows the allowable density on those zones. So as you can see, it kind of cascades downwards as we go down on that column. The density gets higher. And then the next one over is the average density that we expect those new dwellings to develop at. So again, kind of getting larger and larger as we go further down this table. Finally, using that average development density, we divide the 20-year dwelling unit demand there on the far left of that table by that average development density number to determine the net number of of acres required to meet the need there. And then the next column over shows gross buildable land need, which is where we adjust it by 25% to make sure that there is available land for roads, parks, schools, other services that will be required for new residential development. So we land with a total land need of 169 acres across all of those different densities. The next table will show, again, reiterating that buildable land supply table. So what we really care about is that second from the right column there, the total buildable acres. So you can see across all zones, you've got a little under 1,100 acres. So you've got a lot of developable residential land. And this is even keeping in mind constraints. So even unconstrained, you've got about 1,100 acres of buildable residential. Now, of course, a lot of that is in your lower density categories, but the vast majority of the demand is going to be in those categories anyway. And then the next table finally will juxtapose that demand with the buildable land inventory. And in this table, we divide it out by those density categories. So we make sure not only do you have enough gross land overall to accommodate residential, but you have it in the right zones. So you can see there the total demand for single family detached and mobile / manufactured homes is going to be 144 plus 16. And then you've got 965 acres in that category, so a surplus of 805. And then in the townhomes, plexes, and multifamily category, your kind of higher density categories, you've got a demand of 9 acres, you've got a supply of 133 acres, so you've got a surplus of 124. So your total surplus overall is 929, so you've got plenty of residential land in your urban growth boundary. So that's the major takeaway from any housing needs analysis. So we check that box. We know that the urban growth boundary is sufficient to accommodate new demand. So the next step is policy discussion. So that's the end of our analytical work. Any questions about the residential land need analysis?
So I have a question tangentially to this, which is, so we have an idea now of our land inventory, our needs for the next 20 years, number of units, potential population growth. And I worry that this information gets siloed, separated from infrastructure capacity in a city this size, because we've got some big issues with our wastewater treatment plant. We're planning on adding maybe 805 single-family dwellings over the next 20 years. There's a concern about making sure that there's capacity, not to mention the water supply, blah, 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 blah.
Of course.
If you don't mind, I'll step in. There seems to be in recent years a greater effort to include these types of studies in infrastructure master plans. I think historically that hasn't been done as often as it should. Sweet Home also for a long time didn't have properly updated master plans for infrastructure either. And fortunately, we are in the midst of a stormwater master plan. We're in the midst of a water master plan. The sewer plant upgrade is happening. So those factors are improving that, and my department is communicating much better with Public Works on these matters as well. So I'm happy to report that things are improving along those lines. But yes, it's certainly impacted us a lot in the last 20 years.
So knowing that, we just would like to be smarter going forward and integrating knowledge that we have now with projections for the future.
Right.
And certainly that can be a part of the policy discussion as well. You know, often one of the policies we highly recommend is just make sure that your capital improvement plans from those master plans include funding, that they're considered as, and to prioritize infrastructure investments in areas that will yield the most amount of new dwelling units. So, you know, if it's between two areas, let's make sure that we fund the one that will allow us to develop more residential units.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and make the assumption that these numbers in this study in and of itself are going to be shared with multiple departments or made
Yeah.
available to multiple departments.
Yeah, ultimately,
here at
the plan is for this analysis to go through an adoption plan, so it'll go before the city council and certainly be disseminated among all the department heads. One thing I was also going to point out, one of the weaknesses, probably the only weakness of the maps that were all presented, is that they don't show infrastructure, right? Vacant land doesn't always have, some of the reasons why vacant land is vacant is because it doesn't have good infrastructure access. And so that's something to keep an eye on as we move forward, to make sure that we are extending those lines where they need to be extended. The great thing about a city like Sweet Home is that because we're so long geographically, we've got these trunk lines along the railroad and along Main Street that make it relatively easy to extend those infrastructure improvements to the north and the south. And so that's serving us fairly well. But there are some vacant lands that's exactly why they haven't developed, is that it's just really expensive to get the infrastructure moving. Fortunately, we also have in the last year we increased our system development charges. So every home that is built is paying into our water system, our wastewater system, our stormwater system, our parks, and our transportation system, so that we have a funding source for those improvements that will be needed that are not going to, that's basically improvements that are needed by the system but are not necessarily local to a single subdivision. You know, if you put a subdivision in, you're still going to have to extend all the lines and put those all in yourself before you dedicate it over to the city. But at least with the SDC funds that we have, the connections to those areas will be improved. The pump stations and various things that support the overall system have a better funding source now.
This is all very informational. I'll start that over again. This is all very informational. But what do you foresee our role in implementing whatever we need to do? I mean, it's good for us to come and hear a presentation, but we ought to be actively giving some direction to the future of Sweet Home.
Well, hopefully, I mean, you are our steering committee. You're also kind of the champions of this effort. And as Blair said, we were trying to get this adopted formally at council. So, I mean, I would hope that you could, reach out to your city councilors, let them know what you heard and what you learned, and support that process as the steering committee for the housing needs analysis. I mean, that's kind of the basic thing. And also, it's hopefully great information for you to keep in your packet, so when you get people coming in with subdivision proposals or apartment proposals, you can look back and say, oh yeah, this is meeting our need, or look at where the infrastructure is and see, does that match this map here? And so hopefully it'll be good information for you as planning commissioners to make sound decisions moving forward.
I'd add that you'll hopefully get, in addition to this, as we discuss policies, a roadmap for, different things that you'll have to undertake as a body to, for instance, if you were to try to ensure that infrastructure is funded towards areas that would have the highest impact for housing, that's something that the Planning Commission will have a hand in, I would imagine. So hopefully you walk away with a policy roadmap as well from this.
I think one of the things to keep in mind is that comprehensive plans and zoning maps are intended to be living documents that adjust over time as the needs of the community change. So these kinds of studies need to be kept in mind when we review applications to change zoning or change a use over completely to something that's non-residential, or change something that's not residential now over to residential. If someone comes in and wants to rezone a bunch of industrial land, well, you can say, well, we really don't need any more residential land. We've got plenty, but we don't have a ton of industrial land. What's more likely is that we may have, sometime in the future, a relatively large industrial user come in and say, I'd like to put in my development, but I'm going to have to put in this space that you've got marked down as recreation commercial or high density residential or something like that. And the question is going to be, do we allow that change? If we do allow that change, how do we mitigate that effect? Are there other areas where we decide we need to rezone to make up for that change, et cetera? And so this information all needs to be kept in mind when those applications come forward.
I think I have a couple more slides, and then I think the presentation's over. Just wrapping it up, next steps. We already looked at this. I think, like I said, we'll schedule our third meeting when we come back with some policy recommendations. We'll finalize all this, and it'll be in a nice memo for you all to keep and have. So we'll work on scheduling that, and we'll be back to see you again. I don't know if we'll be in person next time, though. We might have to be on the computer. we'll see. We'll see what happens. And then next one is just looking at, thank you. That's it.
Yeah.
Important to remind ourselves.
I would make the request of staff that we take some kind of condensed version of this that could live in the back of our binders to have access to, especially some of the maps that have all the layers overlaid onto them, that we could refer to quickly and easily during a meeting.
I think once we have an adopted version, final version, that's certainly doable.
Okay.
That was going to be my recommendation also is you are all getting new policy binders once the code is updated anyway. So we can add this to it when I do new binders for you all.
Excellent. All right. Do any of the commissioners have any questions for our guests?
Appreciate you coming.
Yeah, I do want to thank you for your time. I know this is not a lot of easy information to throw down, and you presented it very well, and you kept the presentation moving, so thank you so much. I know I kind of nerd out on stuff like this, so I appreciate it. And this is why we're here, to interpret this kind of information and continue to, again, steer our community in the right direction. So thank you.
Thank you all for your patience and you know, your it's nice to have an engaged body. Let's just say that. It's sometimes it gets to be you know, is this having an impact? So it's nice to have a good dialogue.
Well, and it's also good to know that our UGB is completely fine where it's at. We don't need to even address that for quite some time.
Which is too bad because I got some ideas.
Yeah, I bet you do, Blair. All right, if nobody's got anything further, I will go ahead and adjourn this.
Jeff?
Yes,
Commissioner
ma'am.
Partner, you need to close the public hearing first, and then
Absolutely.
you can adjourn the meeting.
All right.
Sorry.
We will go ahead and close the public meeting for the housing needs analysis and buildable lands inventory at 7:18. And then we will go ahead and adjourn the meeting for the Planning Commission for September 15th at 7:19.
And then for those who are present, there's an open house right now for anyone who has questions or wants to chat about what this means for them. Find out what's all the stuff behind it, that anything that wasn't covered. We only have a couple folks here, but you're certainly more than welcome to stick around and chat. But I'm going to go ahead and shut down the meeting. And Angela, you have a good night.
All right, you also. Bye.
Thank you for coming. Hopefully you learned something. Good.
The outdoor event center area.